My clothes clung to my skin, dripping a puddle onto the polished mahogany floor of courtroom 3B. Across the aisle, my sister Beatrice smirked, leaning over to whisper to her lawyer. She thought my ruined suit meant I was broken. She didn't realize what I protected in my soaked briefcase. To understand the absolute audacity of Beatrice's smile that morning, you have to understand the 5 years that preceded it. Our father, Richard Hayes, was a man carved from the blue-collar bedrock of Cleveland, Ohio. He started Hayes Precision Engineering out of a rented one-car garage and built it into a regional powerhouse that supplied parts to major aerospace contractors. He was a brilliant machinist, a fair boss, and a deeply stoic father. After our mother passed away when I was 12 and Beatrice was 14, Dad poured every ounce of his grief into the factory. I followed in his footsteps. By the time I was 25, I was working 60-hour weeks, managing his supply chain, wearing steel-toed boots, and breathing in the metallic scent of machine oil. Beatrice, however, took a different path. She wanted nothing to do with Ohio, nothing to do with the factory, and certainly nothing to do with the grueling reality of building a business. She moved to London, then to Paris, funding a vaguely defined lifestyle consulting career strictly through Dad's guilt-driven wire transfers. We went entire holidays without a phone call from her. She didn't return for Dad's 60th birthday, nor his 65th, but she returned the very week Dr. Harrison Gable diagnosed Dad with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. It was terrifying how fast she mobilized. The prodigal daughter swooped back into Cleveland, feigning tears and packing her designer bags into the guest room of Dad's estate. At first, I was relieved. Running the company while trying to manage Dad's declining health and his grueling chemotherapy sessions was breaking me. I was dangerously naive. Within a month, Beatrice had systematically isolated him. She fired Mrs. Higgins, Dad's trusted housekeeper of 20 years, claiming she was too gloomy. She hired her own private, holistic nurse. When I would come home from the factory at 8 p.m., exhausted and smelling of exhaust, Beatrice would block the door to his bedroom. "He's resting, Clara. The chemo was hard today. He gets so agitated when you bring the stress of the company into the house." Because I loved him, and because I was drowning in the logistics of keeping Hayes Precision afloat, I backed down. I trusted my sister. Dad passed away on a cold Tuesday in November. I was at the factory when he drew his last breath. Beatrice was by his side. The real betrayal, however, didn't happen at the funeral. It happened 2 weeks later, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of Dad's estate attorney, Gregory Finch. I sat across from Beatrice, a tissue clutched in my hand, expecting to hear the terms Dad and I had discussed for years. An even split of his liquid assets, with the controlling shares of the company remaining with me so I could keep it running. Instead, Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat, and produced a document I had never seen before. "This is the updated last will and testament of Richard Thomas Hayes, dated October 14th of this year," Finch read, his voice unnervingly steady. October 14th. 3 weeks before Dad died. A time when he was heavily medicated on fentanyl patches and barely lucid. As Finch read the legalese, the room began to spin. Dad's entire estate, the $5 million home, the investment portfolios, and, most devastatingly, 85% of the voting shares of Hayes Precision Engineering were left exclusively to Beatrice. I was left with a modest, fixed-income trust, contingent on me signing a non-disclosure and non-compete agreement, effectively locking me out of the company I had helped build for a decade. I looked at Beatrice. She was wearing a flawless black silk blouse, staring out the window with an expression of practiced, serene melancholy. "This is a forgery," I whispered, the shock finally giving way to a white-hot fury. Or it's coercion. He was out of his mind on painkillers in October. "Clara, please," Beatrice sighed, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "Dad and I had a lot of deep talks at the end. He realized how much he neglected me growing up. He just wanted to make things right. You always had the factory, but he wanted me to have a future. You plan to liquidate it," I realized, the blood draining from my face. You're going to sell Hayes Precision to the private equity vultures who have been circling us for years. Beatrice didn't deny it. She just offered a sad, tight little smile and stood up. I'm the executor now, Clara. Please clear out your office by Friday. I didn't clear out my office. Instead, I drove straight to the offices of David Ross, a notoriously aggressive litigator who despised bullies as much as I did. I told him everything. We filed an emergency injunction to halt the execution of the will, contesting it on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. The battle lines were drawn. Beatrice had Dad's signature and the legal high ground. I had the truth. An encyclopedic knowledge of Dad's actual wishes, and a burning desperation to save his legacy. We spent 8 grueling months in discovery, fighting tooth and nail for medical records, bank statements, and witness depositions. Beatrice fought us on every single subpoena, draining my personal savings dry. But 2 nights before the final probate hearing, I found the smoking gun. It wasn't in Dad's records, it was in Beatrice's. And it was enough to send her to prison. The morning of the hearing, the sky over Cleveland broke open. It wasn't just rain, it was a torrential, biblical deluge, the kind of severe weather event that prompted flash flood warnings on every local radio station. Sirens wailed in the distance as sheets of water lashed against the siding of my modest apartment. I didn't care. I stood in front of my mirror, buttoning my best navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse. I felt like a soldier putting on armor. Inside my heavy leather briefcase, triple wrapped in plastic grocery bags, was the evidence David Ross and I had stayed up until 3 a.m. organizing. We had finally cracked Beatrice's encrypted offshore accounts. Not only were there emails proving she had bribed the holistic nurse to withhold Dad's cognitive medications, but we had a paper trail showing Beatrice was nearly $2 million in debt to a syndicate of ruthless European creditors. She hadn't come home to comfort a dying man. She had come home to save her own life by stealing his. Furthermore, we had an affidavit from Dr. Harrison Gable, who had previously refused to testify, confirming Dad was completely nonverbal and suffering from severe delirium on October 14th, the day the will was supposedly signed. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp before the Honorable Arthur Pendleton. Judge Pendleton was a legal titan in Cuyahoga County, notorious for his absolute intolerance of tardiness, theatrics, and unprepared counsel. If you weren't seated at the plaintiff's table when the clock struck 9, you had practically forfeited your case. I left my apartment at 7:30 a.m., giving myself an hour and a half for a commute that normally took 20 minutes. The city was a parking lot. Intersections were flooded, traffic lights were short-circuiting, and a jackknifed semi-truck had completely blocked the main interstate artery into downtown. Panic began to bubble in my chest as I sat gridlocked on a side street, the wipers of my 10-year-old Volvo violently thrashing back and forth, failing to clear the glass. By 8:25 a.m., I had moved exactly 3 blocks. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was David Ross. "Clara, where are you?" His normally calm, gravelly voice was tight with stress. "I'm at the courthouse. The clerk says Pendleton is in a foul mood today. Someone just spilled coffee in his chambers. I'm stuck on 9th Street. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. It's completely blocked. I can't move. You have to get here, Clara. If you're not here to verify the origin of these hard copies, Samantha Croft is going to move to have the entire exhibit struck from the record." Samantha Croft was Beatrice's attorney, a shark in designer stilettos, who specialized in making legitimate heirs look like greedy, unhinged conspiracy theorists. "I'll be there," I promised. I looked at the dashboard clock. 8:36 a.m. I was still 6 blocks from the courthouse. If I stayed in the car, I would lose my father's company. I would lose everything. I threw the car into park right there in the gridlocked lane, grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, and shoved open the door. The cold rain hit me like a physical blow. Within 3 seconds, my hair was plastered to my skull. I hit the pavement running. The sidewalks were treacherous, slick with oil and overflowing storm drains. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of the city, driving the freezing rain sideways. I tried to shield my briefcase with my body, hunching over it like a running back protecting a football, taking the brunt of the storm on my back and shoulders. I ran past stranded cars, past pedestrians huddled under awning, past coffee shops where people stared at me through the glass as if I were a madwoman. My lungs burned. A city bus blew past an intersection just as I crossed, sending a massive, gray wave of gutter water splashing over my legs, completely soaking my skirt and filling my leather pumps with icy slush. I gasped at the shock of the freezing water but didn't stop. For Dad, I repeated in my head, a desperate, rhythmic mantra. For the factory. For Dad. 8:51 a.m. The courthouse steps loomed ahead, a massive, imposing structure of gray granite. I slipped on the marble steps, scraping my knee, but scrambled up, gasping for air. I shoved through the heavy revolving doors and nearly collided with the metal detectors. "Bag on the belt, ma'am. Step through," the security guard barked, eyeing my drowned rat appearance with deep suspicion. I threw the briefcase on the conveyor belt and walked through the scanner. My wet clothes weighed 10 extra pounds. My nice white blouse was now translucent and plastered to my skin, my blazer ruined, my hair dripping dark, heavy streams of water onto the floor. I grabbed my bag and sprinted toward the elevators, but the doors were just closing. 8,056 a.m. I took the stairs. 3 flights. My wet shoes squeaked obscenely against the linoleum. Every muscle in my legs screamed in protest, but adrenaline and raw fury fueled my ascent. I burst through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B at exactly 8:59 a.m. The heavy, rhythmic squeak-squelch of my soaked shoes echoed like gunshots in the vast, silent room. All eyes snapped toward the back. There I was, Clara Hayes, looking like a shipwreck survivor. A puddle was already forming around my feet. I was shivering violently, gasping for breath, my makeup entirely washed away, my ruined clothes clinging to my body. David Ross, standing at the plaintiff's table, physically flinched at the sight of me. At the defense table, Samantha Croft raised an impeccably groomed eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line of utter disdain. But it was Beatrice's reaction that made my blood run cold. My sister was wearing a stunning, tailored cream-colored Chanel suit. Her hair was perfectly blown out. She looked dry, wealthy, and entirely in control. As she took in my pathetic, soaked, shivering form, a slow, incredibly cruel smile spread across her face. She leaned over to Samantha Croft, whispered something, and let out a soft, audible chuckle. "Look at her," Beatrice's eyes seemed to say. "Look at this broken, desperate mess." "Well," a booming, thunderous voice echoed from the bench, "it appears the plaintiff has decided to grace us with her presence." And she brought the weather with her. Judge Arthur Pendleton peered down at me over his reading glasses. He was a stern man with thick, white eyebrows and a permanent scowl. He did not look amused. "My apologies, Your Honor," I choked out, my teeth actually chattering. I walked down the aisle, my shoes squelching loudly with every step, ignoring the puddle I was leaving on the beautiful hardwood floor, the roads, the flooding. "The court is aware of the precipitation, Miss Hayes," Judge Pendleton interrupted sharply. "However, this is a court of law, not a locker room. Take your seat." I sank into the wooden chair next to David. He subtly pushed a box of tissues toward me. I took one, wiped the dripping water from my nose, and carefully unclasped the brass locks of my heavy leather briefcase. Beatrice was still smiling. She thought she had already won. She thought my physical state reflected the state of my case, drowned, pathetic, and falling apart. I reached into the briefcase, pulled aside the dry plastic grocery bags, and pulled out the pristine, perfectly dry stack of banking records and Dr. Gable's sworn affidavit. I slid them silently across the table to David. David looked down at the documents, then up at me. A slow, dangerous smile mirrored my own resolve. "Are we ready to proceed, counsel?" Judge Pendleton barked, glaring at our table. "We are, Your Honor," David said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "And we have some newly discovered exhibits we'd like to enter into evidence." Across the aisle, Beatrice's smile finally faltered. The silence in courtroom 3B was absolute, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of rainwater falling from my hemline onto the polished hardwood. Samantha Croft, Beatrice's high-priced attorney, was on her feet instantly, her designer stilettos clicking sharply against the floorboards. Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous ambush. Plaintiff's counsel is attempting to introduce unverified, highly prejudicial documents that were never disclosed during the standard discovery phase. This is a blatant violation of court procedure. David Ross stood his ground, his hands calmly resting on the edges of the plaintiff's table. Your Honor, we only acquired these records at 2 a.m. this morning. They are the result of a protracted, international subpoena battle that defense counsel has aggressively stonewalled for 6 months. These are authenticated SWIFT wire transfer logs from a holding company in the Isle of Man, directly linked to the defendant's personal accounts at Barclays Bank in London. Judge Pendleton's bushy white eyebrows drew together, his scowl deepening. He extended a weathered hand toward the bailiff. Bring them here. The bailiff took the dry, crisp pages from David and handed them up to the bench. Pendleton adjusted his reading glasses. For 3 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the vast room was the rustle of paper and the distant, muffled rumble of thunder outside. I shivered violently, wrapping my arms around my torso. My ruined navy blazer provided zero warmth against the aggressive courtroom air conditioning, and my wet skirt felt like ice against my legs. I glanced across the aisle. Beatrice had leaned back in her chair, but the practiced, serene melancholy had vanished from her face. Her posture was rigid, and her knuckles were stark white where she gripped the handle of her expensive leather handbag. Miss Croft, Judge Pendleton finally spoke, his voice dangerously soft, devoid of the booming irritation he had directed at me earlier. Are you aware that your client appears to have been harboring over $2 million in debt to a private equity syndicate based in Luxembourg? Your Honor, my client's personal finances are entirely irrelevant to the validity of her late father's will, Croft countered, though a slight, almost imperceptible tremor betrayed her forced confidence. They become highly relevant, David interjected, his tone sharpening, when those crushing debts establish a desperate, immediate motive for fraud. And they become critical when paired with Exhibit C. David held up another document, waving it slightly. A sworn affidavit from Dr. Harrison Gable, the former chief of oncology at the Cleveland Clinic, who oversaw Richard Hayes's terminal care. Mentioning the Cleveland Clinic, the undisputed gold standard of medical care in our region, was a heavy anchor of credibility. It wasn't just some hired-gun medical expert. It was an institution renowned worldwide. Pendleton's eyes snapped up, locking onto David. I will allow the exhibits. Mr. Ross, you may call your first witness. The plaintiff calls Beatrice Hayes to the stand, David announced. Beatrice stood. She smoothed the skirt of her tailored Chanel suit, shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom, and walked to the witness box. Her heels clicked with rhythmic authority. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth with perfect, practiced poise. David approached the podium. He didn't start with fire and brimstone. He started with a gentle, almost conversational tone, lulling her into a false sense of security. Miss Hayes, you've testified previously in depositions that you returned from Paris solely out of deep concern for your ailing father. Is that correct? Yes, Beatrice answered, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured emotion. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. Dad was dying. I couldn't bear being an ocean away. I needed to be with him. And during October of last year, the final month of his life, you spent every day by his side? Every single day, Beatrice nodded earnestly, playing to the judge. We talked for hours. He was finally ready to make amends for prioritizing his business over our family when we were young. It was a beautiful, healing time for us. David nodded slowly, letting the lie hang heavy in the courtroom air. Then, he picked up the stack of banking records. Miss Hayes, are you familiar with an offshore entity called Aegis Holdings Limited? Beatrice's jaw tightened. Her eyes darted toward Samantha Croft for a fraction of a second. I may have heard the name, In passing. In passing, David repeated, tasting the words. That's fascinating. Because according to these Barclays Bank records, Aegis Holdings sent you a final, heavily penalized demand notice for $2.4 million on October 1st. Exactly 2 weeks before your father suddenly, inexplicably, changed his will to leave you his entire multi-million-dollar estate. Objection. Relevance and wild speculation. Croft barked, leaping to her feet. Overruled. The witness will answer the question, Pendleton growled, leaning forward, his gaze boring into Beatrice. It was a private business venture, Beatrice snapped, her composure fracturing. Her voice lost its breathy, grieving quality, becoming sharp and defensive. It has absolutely nothing to do with my father or his company. Didn't it? David's voice dropped an octave, the gravelly litigator edge returning in full force. Because on October 15th, the very day after the disputed will was signed, you used your father's newly granted power of attorney to wire $500,000 from his personal savings directly to Aegis Holdings. A good faith payment to keep your aggressive creditors at bay, perhaps? The courtroom erupted into a low, shocked murmur. Even Samantha Croft looked momentarily stunned, furiously flipping through the copies David had handed her, her lips parted in disbelief. Beatrice had lied to her own lawyer. That money was for his medical care. Beatrice shouted over the noise, her voice shrill and desperate. Alternative treatments. The traditional doctors in Ohio had given up on him. I was trying to save his life. Alternative treatments, David said, stepping out from behind the podium. He was relentless now, a predator closing in on its prey. Treatments administered by the holistic nurse you exclusively hired and insisted be left alone with him, a woman named Gwendolyn Price? Yes, Gwen was a miracle worker. She made him comfortable when no one else could. I'm sure she did, David said dryly. He turned his back on Beatrice and faced the judge. Your Honor, we have also subpoenaed the background check and employment history of Gwendolyn Price. She is not a registered nurse. She is not a licensed holistic practitioner. In fact, until 3 years ago, she was an unlicensed massage therapist with a felony conviction for prescription fraud in the state of Florida. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. My heart pounded so hard against my ribs it physically ached. I looked at Beatrice. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and drawn. She looked cornered, wild, and suddenly very small inside her expensive suit. Miss Hayes, David thundered, spinning back around to face the witness box. Isn't it true that you hired a convicted fraud to act as a gatekeeper to your father's bedroom? Isn't it true that you explicitly instructed Miss Price to withhold your father's prescribed cognitive enhancers so he would remain in a state of suggestible, medicated delirium? And isn't it true that on October 14th, Richard Hayes was entirely incapable of understanding, let alone signing, a legal document? No, you're lying. He knew what he was doing. Beatrice screamed, her hands gripping the wooden edge of the witness stand so tightly her knuckles looked bruised. He hated that factory. He knew it consumed his life. It killed our mother with stress, and he wanted to save me from it. He wanted me to be free and wealthy. He was in a hepatic coma, David roared, slamming the Cleveland Clinic affidavit onto the heavy wood railing of the jury box with a deafening thud. That is enough. The voice of Judge Arthur Pendleton echoed through the room like a thunderclap. The entire courtroom froze in terrifying silence. Pendleton wasn't looking at David Ross. He wasn't looking at the defense attorney. He was glaring directly at Beatrice Hayes with a mixture of profound disgust and righteous, unyielding fury. The petty annoyance he had directed at me 30 minutes earlier for dripping water on his floor was entirely gone, replaced by the terrifying wrath of a veteran judge who realizes his courtroom has just been used as a stage for horrific elder abuse. Pendleton held up Dr. Gable's affidavit. His large, weathered hands were shaking slightly with suppressed anger. I have before me a sworn statement from the chief of oncology at the Cleveland Clinic, Pendleton said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that carried to every corner of the room. Dr. Gable states, unequivocally, that as of October 12th, Richard Hayes's liver had completely failed. Toxins had flooded his brain. He was suffering from end-stage hepatic encephalopathy. He could not recognize his own daughters. He could not speak a coherent sentence, let alone comprehend the vast complexities of a multi-million-dollar estate transfer. Pendleton took off his reading glasses and pointed them at Beatrice like a loaded weapon. "You came into my courtroom," the judge continued, each word dripping with utter contempt, and attempted to use the legal system of this county to legitimize the financial exploitation of a dying, defenseless man. "Your own father. Your Honor, please." Samantha Croft stood up, her voice completely devoid of its usual shark-like arrogance. "My client?" "Sit down, counselor," Pendleton snapped, not breaking eye contact with Beatrice for a microsecond. "Unless you wish to join your client in being investigated for suborning perjury, I strongly suggest you remain entirely silent for the remainder of these proceedings." Croft slowly sank back into her leather chair. She physically shifted her chair an inch to the left, putting distance between herself and Beatrice's empty seat at the table. It was the ultimate professional abandonment. In the witness box, Beatrice's perfectly blown-out hair suddenly looked limp, sticking to the cold sweat on her forehead. The Chanel suit looked like a child's costume. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some glib excuse, but no words came out. Her jaw worked silently. The arrogant smirk, the condescending chuckles that had mocked my ruined appearance, they were dead and buried under the crushing weight of reality. "This court is calling an immediate recess," Judge Pendleton announced, picking up his wooden gavel. "Based on the overwhelming evidence of medical incapacity and severe undue influence, I am permanently invalidating the will dated October 14th. The previous will, leaving the controlling shares of Hayes Precision Engineering to Clara Hayes, is hereby reinstated with immediate effect." He wasn't finished. "Furthermore," Pendleton added, towering over his bench and glaring down at Beatrice, "I am forwarding the unedited transcripts of today's proceedings, along with these offshore banking records and the background check of Miss Price, directly to the Cuyahoga County District Attorney's Office. I am strongly recommending they open an immediate criminal investigation into wire fraud, elder abuse, and perjury." The gavel struck the sounding block with a loud, violent crack that made Beatrice flinch as if she had been struck. "Court is adjourned." The bailiff loudly ordered everyone to rise as the judge swept out of the room, his black robes billowing behind him. I didn't stand. I couldn't. My legs wouldn't support my weight. I sat at the plaintiff's table, a shivering, soaking wet mess. A puddle still surrounded my squelching shoes. My ruined blouse clung uncomfortably to my skin, and my teeth were chattering uncontrollably from the intense air conditioning and the brutal crash of pure adrenaline. But as I looked across the aisle at my sister, who was now hyperventilating and sobbing into her hands while her own lawyer hurriedly packed her briefcase, refusing to look at her, I had never felt warmer. David Ross slowly packed away his files, then reached over and gently placed a warm hand on my trembling shoulder. "You did it, Clara," he said softly, a tired but triumphant smile on his face. "You saved the factory. You saved his legacy." I closed my eyes, listening to the heavy rain, still lashing relentlessly against the tall courthouse windows. The storm outside was raging, flooding the streets and stopping the city in its tracks. But the storm inside my life had finally, mercifully, broken. I finally stood up. My knees popped, stiff from the bone-deep chill of my wet clothes and the sudden, violent crash of my adrenaline. Across the aisle, Samantha Croft was zipping her designer leather briefcase with brutal, practiced efficiency. "Samantha, wait," Beatrice pleaded, her voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy whine. "You can't just leave. We have to file an appeal. We have to talk to the judge, explain the circumstances. We have to do something." Croft didn't even look at her. She snapped the brass locks of her briefcase shut. "My retainer covers civil probate litigation, Miss Hayes. It does not cover federal wire fraud, perjury, or criminal elder abuse. I suggest you find a very good, very aggressive defense attorney. Today." Without another word, the shark in stilettos marched down the aisle, and out of courtroom 3B, leaving Beatrice entirely abandoned at the defense table. Beatrice slowly turned her panicked eyes to me. The immaculate Chanel suit was now horribly wrinkled. Her perfect, expensive blowout was a frizzy, tangled mess from the courtroom humidity and her own cold sweat. She looked like a cornered animal, entirely stripped of the haughty, European sophistication she had weaponized against me for the last year. "Clara," she whispered, taking a hesitant step toward the center aisle. "Clara, please. You know I didn't mean for it to go this far. The men I owed, the syndicate in Luxembourg. They said they knew where I lived. I was terrified. I just needed enough to pay them off." I looked at the woman who shared my blood, expecting to feel a surge of vindictive triumph. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, just a profound, hollow exhaustion that settled into my very bones. "You locked me out of his room, Beatrice," I said, my voice eerily calm, barely louder than the relentless rain hammering against the tall judicial windows. "You watched our father hallucinate in agony so you could steal the factory he built with his bare hands. You traded his dignity for your debts. Don't ask me for grace. You burned it all." I turned my back on her, picked up my heavy, water-stained leather briefcase, and walked out of the courtroom. My wet shoes squeaked all the way down the marble corridor, but it was the best sound I had ever heard. It sounded like freedom. The legal aftermath was swift, merciless, and entirely public. Judge Arthur Pendleton was not a man who made empty threats from the bench. By Friday afternoon of that same week, District Attorney Thomas Kellerman had opened a full-scale criminal probe into the final 2 months of Richard Hayes's life. The first domino to fall was Gwendolyn Price. The so-called holistic nurse didn't even make it to an interrogation room before she broke. The moment Cuyahoga County detectives showed up at her cheap motel in Akron, she offered a full, unredacted confession in exchange for a plea deal. Gwendolyn handed over a mountain of evidence: encrypted text messages, wire transfer receipts, and voice memos proving that Beatrice had explicitly directed her to substitute Dad's crucial cognitive medications with heavy, unregulated sedatives. Gwendolyn admitted, on tape, that she was paid $50,000 under the table to keep Dad completely docile and to physically block me from seeing him during his rare, lucid windows. With Gwendolyn's confession, D.A. Kellerman had a bulletproof case. But the investigation revealed an even darker twist. In her blind panic after Judge Pendleton invalidated the forged will, Beatrice didn't just accept defeat. Desperate to appease the European syndicate, who were now freezing her offshore accounts and threatening her physical safety, she attempted a final, wildly reckless maneuver. 24 hours after our courtroom showdown, Beatrice tried to take out a massive $2 million commercial loan against the factory's heavy machinery, clumsily forging my signature as the reinstated majority shareholder. The bank flagged the discrepancy immediately and alerted the authorities. That was the final nail in the coffin. It wasn't just elder abuse anymore. It was aggravated identity theft and felony bank fraud. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my modest apartment, finally warm and dry, when the evening news flashed across the television screen. There was Beatrice, stripped of her silk blouses and designer handbags, wearing a standard-issue county orange jumpsuit. Her hands were cuffed in front of her as she was led into the courthouse. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Socialite daughter indicted on multiple felony fraud charges." The syndicate she owed millions to didn't care that she was in a jail cell. They aggressively moved to seize whatever assets she had left, liquidating her Paris apartment and taking her remaining cash. She had gambled our father's legacy to save her own skin, and in the end, she lost absolutely everything. She was facing up to 15 years in state prison. I didn't attend her arraignment. I had a business to run. The Monday after the judge's ruling, I pulled my old, reliable Volvo into the gravel parking lot of Hayes Precision Engineering. The storm had finally passed over the weekend, leaving the Cleveland sky a brilliant, bruised, cloudless blue. I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath. The familiar, sharp scent of ozone, cut steel, and heavy machine oil hit my lungs. To Beatrice, this place was a dirty, blue-collar prison to be escaped from. To me, it was the beating heart of our family. It was the scent of my father's life's work. I walked through the heavy steel double doors onto the main factory floor. The deafening, beautiful roar of the CNC machines and the rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of the hydraulic presses washed over me. Sparks showered from the welding bays, and forklifts beeped as they moved heavy pallets of raw materials. Arthur Artie Jenkins, our burly floor manager who had worked alongside my dad for 30 years, saw me first. He wiped his thick, calloused hands on a greasy rag and hit the kill switch on his lathe. Slowly, the other machinists noticed. One by one, the heavy machines powered down until the cavernous, metal warehouse was eerily quiet. Artie walked up to me, his face lined with grease, age, and months of severe anxiety. He had been terrified, knowing that if Beatrice won, the private equity firm would strip the machinery, sell the land to developers, and lay off all 80 of his guys without pensions. "So?" Artie asked, his voice gruff, echoing in the quiet factory. "What's the word, boss?" I smiled, genuinely smiling for the first time since the day Dr. Gable had delivered Dad's diagnosis. "The word is that the vultures are permanently gone, Artie," I said loudly, making sure my voice carried across the floor. "The company belongs to us again. We have 3 major aerospace contracts to fulfill by Friday. Let's get back to work." A cheer erupted from the floor, a rough, booming, masculine sound of profound relief and triumph. Several of the older machinists actually took off their safety glasses to wipe their eyes. They had watched me grow up on this very floor, learning to sweep the metal shavings before I ever learned to run a balance sheet. They knew I would never sell them out. The machines roared back to life, louder and more energetic than before. I walked up the grated metal stairs to the glass-walled office overlooking the production floor. Dad's office. I walked in and sat heavily in his worn leather chair. On the corner of the heavy oak desk sat a framed photograph of Dad and me at my college graduation, his arm thrown proudly around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. I reached out and adjusted the frame, wiping a tiny speck of dust from the glass. The legal bills would take years to pay off, and the betrayal of my only sibling would leave a permanent, aching scar. But the factory was safe. The storm that tried to drown me ended up washing away the lies my sister built. Beatrice sought a shortcut to wealth, destroying our father's final days in the process. But legacies are not forged in shadows or stolen by deceit. They are built with grease, sweat, and unyielding truth. As the factory machines roar back to life below, I know my father's spirit remains safe here with me today.